Mr Chair, thank you. I'd like to speak on the committee stage of the Motor Vehicles Sales Amendment Bill and just make a few comments in relation to my colleague, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell's comments with regard to people's purchasing habits online. And while she may not yet have made her first car purchase online, many New Zealanders have. I don't actually have the statistics in front of me as to how many are doing that at this point, but not only are they purchasing motor vehicles and camera lenses and other things, they're also a growing trend to people buying and selling houses online, and these are, as my other colleague Carol Beaumont has mentioned today, are major purchases in people's lives and major decisions that they're making, and it's absolutely critical that when they enter into the contract to buy or sell those items, that they, that particularly people purchasing, can trust the process and trust that that they're not being duped. So that's one of the reasons why this bill is very important, and I want to thank all of my colleagues on the Select Committee for their work on this bill, and also again make mention of the previous Minister, the Honourable Heather Roy, for her work on the bill and in general on her portfolio area. And I'd also like to congratulate the new Minister, the incoming Minister, the Honourable John Boscawen, on his new role, and really looking forward to hearing his pronouncements and his what he's got to say on this bill and on future issues referring to consumers, because one of the things that's the most important thing about this bill and why we're supporting it is because it's very much a common sense bill, and it's a step in the right direction, and it really is making some quite important amendments to current law. It was a bill, as you've heard, that was initiated under Labor, and also in reference to what other speakers have said, given New Zealanders' high proportion of vehicle ownership, it is a bill that will make a difference for many consumers. And the members on this side of the House certainly do care about consumers, and any legislation that's about protection of consumers is an important thing. As my colleague Leanne Dalzell also mentioned, we are perplexed why this bill has come up in urgency again. I think this is the third time that I've spoken on this bill, and I think every single time it's been an urgency. And while obviously it's a tremendously urgent bill, it does seem to have taken quite a long time in between the bits of urgency for it to come back to the House. And I don't know about that, but I feel a bit perplexed about how something can be so urgent and then there's a big pause between it and the next bit of it. So I have been scratching my head a bit that today, given particularly the important issues that are out there at the moment around the number of New Zealanders who are out of work, with the economy trying to move out of a very bumpy recession, and the importance of, one would think, the priorities of this government to try and be creating jobs and getting people back into work. But however, there must be, I think this urgent bill must somehow fit into a wider plan that maybe we're not quite aware of at the moment. And one of the things in thinking about it last week, or the last time I spoke about it, and I thought it is worth mentioning again, given that the quite lively discussion that followed my last speech on this bill, which is where, given that many people, as we've heard, are not able or struggling to afford to run a car, let alone consider selling one and buying one because of the rising costs that they're facing, and the result of the emissions trading scheme, which I'm sure that the new Minister will have a number of things to say, that those costs that are being put onto ordinary consumers, and the fact that they're facing rises in GST, many of them are losing jobs and struggling to find new ones. And while I was reflecting on that last time I spoke on this bill, I talked about how, Mr Chair,
Claire Curran.
And this is very important, Mr. Chair, because I reflected on the importance of the purchasing decision of buying a new car, and I reflected on my first decision on buying a car and what that car was, which was a Morris 10, a 1948 Morris 10, kind of blue with runner boards and those little indicator things that flicked out, and you did have a crank thing in it, although that you didn't have to use that very often. But he was a great car, Maurice. His name was Maurice, and as a result of that discussion, and I think I had him for about a year and a half, and then it cost $125 to buy him, and I sold him again about a year and a half later for $125, which I thought was a pretty good deal, really. But I did reflect, and I asked other members of the House who were speaking on this bill to reflect on their first cars, and because we've, over this side of the House, have got a good outlet in how to express our views and get our thoughts out there, called Red Alert, which is a blog, and I'm sure a few of you have heard of it and might even read it. I did a little post on Red Alert about it, and it was an extraordinary number of responses from people right across the House and out there in the community who got quite emotional about their first cars and the importance of that purchasing decision, which brings me back to the motor vehicle sales amendment bill, and the importance of the decision. That and why it's so important when you're making that, and why you need to be protected, and why consumers do need to be protected under that bill. And I thought I'd like to put it to the incoming minister today. He might like to share with us some of his purchasing decisions around cars, and we'd, I'm sure, all be really, really interested to know what his first car was, because I think it actually says a lot about the person as to the decisions that you make about purchasing important things like your and I mean another really important it would be really interesting to know what other members like, for instance, the Honourable Tony Ryle, what his first car was. And I know that the Speaker, the Honourable Lockwood Smith, he takes a great interest in car purchasing decisions, as I'm sure does the Mr. Chair who's sitting in the seat over there. So anyway, coming back to the Motor Vehicle Sales Amendment Bill and its importance, we know and we've heard that that this bill is amending the Motor Vehicle Sales Act, which was passed by the previous Labor government in December 2003. And it's important because it's about bringing it, the provisions in that bill into the 21st century, making them much more, those consumer protections more transparent, and making sure that new technologies that have emerged since then and are being used for making the sales of vehicles and are robust, and that those protections apply to those platforms as well. And it'd be interesting to do a search on TradeMe to see whether there are any 1948 Morris 10s still for sale on a place like TradeMe, which is where many people these days are actually going and looking for vehicles and actually purchasing them. But the Act seeks to introduce a new registration regime for motor vehicle traders, and it also makes them more accountable to consumers, and will also offer some degree of flexibility to participate in the motor vehicle industry. And we've heard that the policy that underpins this Act has got several core elements which do ensure accountability. They include the requirement for those trading vehicles to be registered, more disclosure concerning used motor vehicles, and the provision for consumer remedies through the Motor Vehicles Disputes Tribunal. And I know that my colleague Carol Beaumont has got quite a lot of good thoughts on that. The bill also increases the financial limit on the jurisdiction of the Motor Vehicle Disputes Tribunal from $50,000 to $100,000, which is very important given that consumers have avenues for recourse when it comes to trading. And and it also intends to reduce the compliance costs.